As of now, we have the following latest information, which concerns those American voters who have already cast their ballots for a particular candidate. In the United States, more than 70 million people have already voted early in the presidential election. Most early votes were cast in Florida, Texas, and California. 37.5 million people voted at polling stations. 32.5 million by mail. Kamala Harris, meanwhile, is unexpectedly ahead of Donald Trump in Iowa. There, she received 47% against 44% for Donald Trump. This is quite specific, as it is a state where former President Donald Trump has won twice. The last time Democrats led in Iowa was in 2012, and according to preliminary results among those voters who decided to cast their ballots early, Kamala Harris is currently winning. However, these are very preliminary results, and the situation may change as early as November 5th, or on the contrary, Kamala Harris may consolidate her leadership in this important state for Republicans.
Дуже передчасні результати, і уже 5 листопада картина може змінитися, або ж навпаки, Камала Харріс підтвердить.
As the American election approaches, we are seeing more and more articles in the Western press, not only about what an eccentric Donald Trump's victory might mean, but also about what it would mean for Ukraine.
Стосовно того, а що ж може означати перемога ексцентричного Дональда Трампа на виборах. Ну і найперше нас з вами цікавить, що це буде означати для України.
The American TV channel CNN came out with a story that even if Trump wins, it will be a long shot. Putin is unlikely to hold peace talks with Ukraine. Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, it is unlikely that Russian dictator Putin will agree to sit down at the negotiating table to end Russia's war against Ukraine. This is the subject of a story published by CNN today. If elected, Kamala Harris is expected to continue the policies of the Biden administration, which supported Ukraine despite some disagreements, such as allowing the use of Western weapons to strike deep into Russian territory. Republican candidate Donald Trump has taken a radically different position. He has repeatedly claimed he will cease support for Kyiv's military efforts and can resolve the war in one day. Moreover, as experts note, the terms of the peace plan proposed by his candidate for Vice President J.D. Vance's list is very similar to that of dictator Putin. Trump is considering what levers of influence he has left, which is unclear at the moment, but it is unlikely to be a quick process. This is the opinion of Thomas Graham, an expert on Russian foreign policy and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. As he says, with any potential American president, Putin will try to exploit what he sees as, quote, U.S. political dysfunction and cracks in Western unity. Such cracks could manifest themselves in the form of the Trump administration cutting aid to Ukraine, as well as less participation in NATO or a split Congress. Possible financial pressure on the U.S. European allies will also play a role, as will tensions in NATO relations. With pro-Russian authorities in member states such as Hungary or Slovakia. Without Western unity and a clear shared vision of battlefield goals, the situation remains uncertain. Putin has no reason to reconsider his actions in Ukraine at this stage. The scale of Russia's war against Ukraine is too large for... Experts interviewed by CNN say that such a future hypothetical agreement is part of a much broader conflict between Russia and the West, and that for Putin, Ukraine is just a means to an end, and the end is to further limit the influence of the United States on the world order.
Для досягнення своєї мети, а мета ще більше обмежити вплив Сполучених Штатів на загалом світовий порядок.
This is already being said by John Lowe, a research fellow at the Russia and Eurasia program at the Chatham House think tank in London. When Trump's advisors explained to him what's really going on, and that China has played a key role in supporting Russia's ability to continue to wage this war, Trump may suddenly feel very acutely that he is not so good with Putin, says a representative of the center. In his opinion, Beijing will see any concessions as another indication of U.S. weakness, which contradicts Trump's tough public rhetoric on the Chinese threat. Experts warn that if political confusion over support for Ukraine continues post-election, Kiev's Western allies are unprepared to provide the necessary resources for significant success on the battlefield. So it is likely that support for Ukraine will continue, perhaps with less intensity, but for a long time. Of course, the Harris administration will not sell out Ukrainians, but it will test their resolve and whether they are ready to continue to wage this exhausting war. Analysts agree on this point, and returning to the topic of negotiations in general, it is worth recalling that this track, so to speak, began on March 29th. In fact, a little more than a month after the Russian invasion, when negotiations between Ukraine and Russia took place in Istanbul on March 22nd. However, in the second half of the spring, this process reached a dead end, and 6 months later, I would remind you that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky enacted the decision of the National Security and Defense Council to not negotiate with Russian dictator Putin, which was a response to the attempted annexation of the occupied Ukrainian territories. Already in mid-June this year, the New York Times published documents about those peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. The conflicting issues, again, according to the publication, were the level of armament of the armed forces of Ukraine, the conditions for Ukraine's potential membership in the EU and NATO, and certain cultural laws on language that Russia wanted to abolish. So this is what those negotiations were about. But this year, at a meeting of the General Assembly, the Russian side released information that Ukraine had asked for the resumption of negotiations with Turkey's mediation. This is the information that was available in the fall of this year, but it was categorically denied in Ukraine. Meanwhile, we see some new statements from Turkey. The Foreign Ministry predicts a new situation in Russia's war against Ukraine as early as 2025. In particular, such a statement was made by the Turkish Foreign Minister, who says that such a moment may indeed come, as both sides are exhausted.
Він, зокрема, говорить про те, що дійсно, власне, такий момент може наступити, оскільки обидві сторони виснажені.
According to Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, in an interview with the local media, Turkey maintains relations with both Russia and Ukraine. According to him, and I quote, "The search for common ground between the parties is ongoing, and neither country, he said, wants to be defeated." The fatigue of the parties may lead to a new situation in 2025. We'll see how things develop. We have a special relationship with both sides. We do not refuse to listen to both sides. Fidan emphasized that the end of the war must be just, taking into account the territorial integrity of Ukraine. This statement from Turkey is significant. On October 21st, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga met with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to discuss defense cooperation. 2 days later, Erdogan met with Putin at the BRICS summit, where they discussed improving trade relations. Turkish officials have consistently supported Ukraine's return to its 1991 borders, including Crimea, through diplomatic means.
Ми пам'ятаємо, що офіційні особи Туреччини, по суті, завжди заявляли, що підтримують
Just 2 days ago, the Russian Foreign Ministry was outraged.
Повернення Криму, однак дипломатичним шляхом. Ну і буквально 2 дні тому в російському МЗС
In particular, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, if I may say so, then said that Turkey continues to provide military assistance to Ukraine in the war that Russia itself has unleashed. But I think what's important about this statement by the Turkish foreign minister is that the point where he says that the fatigue of the parties could lead to a situation in 2025. Here he emphasizes the fatigue of both sides. We can see from the situation on the battlefield that Russia is now throwing literally every possible force at it to achieve results as soon as possible before the winter of this year. Many military analysts, not only military analysts, agree that Russia is indeed ready to put everything on the line to make Ukraine and its Western partners and allies believe that a Russian victory is impossible. Therefore, the only option left is to sit down with the Russian dictator and actually negotiate. It is obvious that in this case, Putin will bargain for the best conditions for himself, if at that time the Russian army will actually secure the positions on the battlefield, when Putin will be able to talk to Ukraine's partners and to Ukraine, perhaps through the mediation of certain parties from a position of strength. So it is obvious that this is Russia's plan. Our task is to actually do everything possible to hold out during this very difficult and crucial period. And in fact, as we can see, and according to the head of our general staff and the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Syrsky, when he says that this is the most difficult phase of the war for the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the situation on the battlefield is quite critical. In particular, when we analyze the maps and the Russians' progress, we really see this. But at the same time, we need to understand that this is the pressure that Russia is exerting to convince us that victory is impossible. Returning, in fact, to Russia's strong positions, if I may say so, or to the strengthening of certain Russian lines, including pressure on the battlefield, the appearance of the North Korean military is an important factor here. And it is obvious that Russia is acting at a time when the United States is busy with elections, and accordingly, realizing that they will do everything possible to avoid escalation across the ocean, we have now seen the appearance of North Korean military in Russia, as well as preparations for participation in hostilities against Ukraine. But the position of China is also important here. There were many discussions and assumptions in the information space, not only about what China's position might be. Some believe that the transfer of military personnel from the DPRK to Russia could not have taken place without China's consent. However, we see an article from the Wall Street Journal that says
передача військових з КНДР до Росії не могла відбутися без згоди Китаю. Але от зараз ми
that sending troops from the DPRK to Russia is in fact unacceptable to China.
Відправка військ КНДР до Росії є начебто неприйнятною для Китаю.
According to American journalists, the North Korean regime sending thousands of soldiers to Russia to participate in the war against Ukraine poses risks to the Chinese government and tests the limits of its ability to influence its nuclear-armed neighbors. As noted in the publication, the Chinese authorities are most concerned that the North Koreans' participation in Russia's war against Ukraine could lead to an even greater expansion of military partnerships between the United States, Western Europe, and their allies in the Asia-Pacific region. and in the future such partnerships could help Washington find allies in any potential conflict with China over the island of Taiwan. According to the director of the Institute of International Studies at Nanjing University, Chu Feng, sending North Korean troops to Russia, whose total number, according to U.S. officials, is about 10,000, is unacceptable to China, as the country's authorities are seeking to end hostilities. I will quote this analyst next. This not only introduces new strategic confusion into the war in Ukraine, but also signals the expansion of such a war. Beijing may be afraid that this regional conflict, from China's point of view, will turn into an intercontinental one. According to Eric Balbach, a researcher at According to the Free Foundation of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, China may consider Russia's direct support for North Korea's strategic weapons as a red line. But even then, the possibilities for Beijing to stop any actions by either country will be limited and may seem less attractive than maintaining the current state of affairs. China has clearly faced the reality that it is losing influence over Pyongyang, while Russia is gaining it, the expert said. Over the past year, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un has made a sharp turn, paying much more attention to Russia than to China. He sent over 10 letters to Putin in 2024, 3 times more than his correspondence with Xi Jinping. Russians can travel to North Korea, but Chinese citizens cannot. According to the Wall Street Journal, Russian dictator Putin can offer North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and vice versa, something that official Beijing cannot.
Може запропонувати північно-корейському лідеру Кім Чен Іну і навпаки, те, чого офіційний Пекін запропонувати не може.
Russia needs labor and ammunition, and the DPRK needs new technologies.
Потрібні нові технології.
At the same time, the Chinese authorities, as far as we can see, do not publicly speak about North Korean troops in Russia. And Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian said that bilateral relations between North Korea and Russia are a matter for them, and repeated Beijing's official thesis that China calls on all parties to de-escalate the situation and find a political solution.
Ну і крім того, Китай сповідує політику і намагається, і точніше хоче відповідних відносин.
Additionally, China expects other countries to respect its policy of non-interference in internal affairs, making it unlikely for China to interfere in relations between Russia and North Korea.
Виключно їхня справа. Тому з цієї позиції для Китаю, мовляв, також було би дивно втручатися у відносини між Росією та Північною Кореєю.
According to Miles Yu, former advisor to the U.S. presidential administration on China policy, China does not want to publicly declare an alliance with these countries. But at the same time, China will never give up its secret, or at least indirect, assistance to Russia and North Korea, the expert said. Unlike Moscow and Pyongyang, Beijing will not behave too openly, as it wants to create a facade to stay in the world free trade system and maintain its global position. An interesting article on China's position on deepening cooperation between Russia and North Korea. Based on this analysis, China is indeed not interested and even considers it unacceptable for it to send North Korean military to Russia. It is clear that the alliance between Pyongyang and Moscow is strengthening Russia's influence on North Korea. This leads to China losing such influence. We will analyze in more detail how critical this can really be for China, together with our next speaker, Valery Dymov, a political scientist who is already joining us on the air. Valery, good afternoon. I've just shared a Wall Street Journal article stating that the deployment of North Korean troops to Russia is unacceptable to China, as it diminishes China's influence over Pyongyang. Do you agree with this view? Obviously, the Wall Street Journal has been closely following our broadcasts since the beginning of Putin's contacts with Kim Jong-un. We talked about how this is unfavorable for Xi Jinping and China, because we have to understand that it was practically thanks to China that North Korea, back in the days of Kim Jong-un and Kim Il-sung's ancestors, got what it has today. This happened, in particular, thanks to the war with the United Nations, and it was the Chinese, hundreds of thousands of Chinese, who actually created the regime that exists today through local assaults. Putin is actually pulling Kim Jong-un and his regime out from under Chinese influence to some extent. Kim Jong-un, to a certain extent, is already starting to play on the backlash, trying to use a certain gap of more or less freedom and demonstrating dissatisfaction with Russia's policy towards him. China also sees what's happening, and I think that in this triangle, Kim Jong-un is the party that benefits from this so-called cooperation, because he is getting out of control. Xi Jinping doesn't like it, but he doesn't like a lot of things, because it has a difficult economic situation inside the country. On the one hand, it is a beneficiary of Putin's aggression against Ukraine and the West, and this is to Xi Jinping's advantage to some extent. But on the other hand, China has gained all its economic power by entering the civilized global market and depends on it no less than this market depends on China. So Kim Jong-un is trying to play in this gap created by Putin. Putin, in turn, is not coming to Kim Jong-un from a good life. He used to dictate terms to the United States, remember, 2.5 years ago, putting forward the idea that Russia's borders do not end, including through Europe. He does not bow to Kim Jong-un out of a good life and does not receive businesses from him for free during his trips to the Far East. This is also due to the need to receive missiles starting in the fall of 2022. It is clear that Kim Jong-un is not doing this for free. Given that we hear calls from China not to interfere in the internal affairs of the country and in relations between states, in particular between China and Russia, can we imagine that Beijing might take more drastic steps to limit Moscow's influence on Pyongyang? I would like that, but it is unlikely to happen, as the world is much more complex than just linear processes. For example, if you look at financial indicators, you can see that almost all Chinese ratings are falling, despite the second stage of fiscal injections into financial markets. The Chinese economy has lost momentum, especially in the construction industry. We remember the $360 billion invested in just one company. Looking at the trade between Russia and China, which is $250 billion, we see that $360 billion is just one private company.
Побудовані і не розпродані. Вони цілі квартали зносили, тому що ці квартири не продаються, а люди брали позики в банках. Тобто дуже багато такого роду процесів. Сі Цзіньпін
Entire cities remain unsold and neighborhoods are being demolished due to unsold apartments. Many took out loans, prompting Xi Jinping to make radical changes, breaking Communist Party traditions in his quest for reform. Putin and Kim Jong-un recognize this, but the world faces no good solutions.
Але світ вже загнаний в таку ситуацію, в якій нема гарних рішень ні для кого. І тому Сі Цзіньпін залежить, я вже сказав, від світу. Він торгує з Європою, він торгує з США.
Xi Jinping is dependent on the global market. He trades with Europe and the United States, getting Russian resources cheaply. He also has access to rare materials in Africa, Latin America, and South America, influencing Brazil and the global South. But these plans take into account Putin's interests, because Xi Jinping wants to be an influential player. Putin once thought that he could dictate terms to the world, but in reality, we see that the telephone that was put in place after the Cuban Missile Crisis between Washington and Moscow is now working between Beijing and Washington. We have to understand that China actually produces the goods it has thanks to its large industrial capacity, but it does not sell them to Africa, Latin America, or Russia, because they do not have the same purchasing power. He has to sell them to Europe and the United States. So on the one hand, he would not want this war to last long, but on the other hand, he is the beneficiary of the situation. It receives energy at a discount, as Putin is in a situation where China dictates the news about power of Siberia too, oil and gas prices. However, we have to understand that the world does not want Putin to fail, as further processes may be unfavorable for China. We would like to see drastic actions and statements, but Chinese diplomacy is slow. Xi Jinping is making statements amid concerns that Putin raised the stakes on nuclear weapons in 2022. When Xi warned of nuclear war, he wasn't specifically referencing the US or Ukraine. Meanwhile, Putin has deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Putin relies on Kim Jong-un, while Lukashenko seeks to distance himself from Moscow by turning to Xi for financial and political support. We would like to see changes, but it is not easy, because the world has allowed the moment when Russia started raising the stakes and blackmailing with nuclear weapons. Everyone understands that Putin will not be able to capture Seoul or attack South Korea, but his military forces could damage the territory of South Korea, which would affect the market. When I read the Western sanctions against Kim Jong-un, I ask what other sanctions can be applied against him. They are already living in poverty, and you supported them so that they would not die of hunger. Не так буде нищити територію і громадян Південної Кореї, як завалить весь ринок Південної Кореї, перепрошую, азійський ринок, і тільки корейський, в тому числі і китайський ринок. They are 15 centimeters smaller than their brothers in South Korea, an antisocial experiment where the worst is happening. Перепрошую, проти Кім Чен Ына. Які це санкції? Вони там травоїли, а ви їх підтримували для того, щоб вони там не вмирали з голоду. Люди менше, аніж їхні брати в Південній Кореї на 15 сантиметрів. Такий, знаєте, антисоціальний експеримент, антиєвгеніка, коли найгірше відбувається. Тому певною мірою простих рішень тут, на жаль, немає. І there are no easy solutions here, and all players realize this. Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and Putin. Because of this, tensions will continue. When Putin raises the stakes in his conversations with the West, he does the same with the East. Це не означає, що він впливає на порядок денний, це означає, що певною мірою він шантажує, тому що це десь для Кремля, Путіна і Росії це остання війна, і прекрасно вони розуміють, що за ціною, як вони раніше співали. This does not mean that he is influencing the agenda, but rather blackmailing, because this is the last war for the Kremlin. They realize that the price is not worth it. Another threat to China is the close cooperation between Russia and North Korea, which encourages Western countries to cooperate.
Теж кооперуватися, і фактично для Пекіна може бути викликом те, що союз, який мається на увазі, наприклад, Сполучених Штатів, країн Тихого океану.
This may be a challenge for Beijing, as the alliance between the United States and the Indo-Pacific countries may strengthen, which China will not like. What could prompt the Chinese leader to act? Xi Jinping will not give up on the West, because for him, this is also a confrontation.
Ми говорили про проблеми китайського лідера, але поставте себе, мене на його місце і наших глядачів. Ну а що йому робити? Він же не буде здаватися тому.
Chinese civilization is thousands of years old, and for it, the West is, relatively speaking, an upstart that has recently appeared. I'm not talking about how things really are, but only how they are perceived in China. Sun Tzu wrote his treatises, and we understand that there were no such things as what we call the West today. It describes how to conduct war, negotiations, how to dictate the agenda. These things were set out long before in European treatises describing states and their rulers. So to a certain extent, we have to understand that there are no easy solutions for him. He is a beneficiary in this war, forgetting all the problems he had with human rights, with Hong Kong and the Uyghur Autonomous Region. Scholz, Macron, and Ursula von der Leyen visit him, asking for cooperation, and he likes it, and the Chinese like it. So he is indeed a beneficiary, but I emphasize again that he depends on global markets. The 8 army brigades I mentioned, they are with Kim Jong-un, can destroy everything that is called the Chinese miracle, because we understand perfectly well that China needs to sell goods not to Africa, not to Russia, but to the United States and Europe, because that is where there is a solvent population. These markets can absorb Chinese goods. Without this, Chinese goods will be like unsold apartments. It is clear that there are challenges and threats, including to China. When a kind of axis is created, so to speak, when Putin creates outright enemies, rebels suffering from hunger, and this is a protest against the greedy West, even without the communist idea, it no longer matters. The main thing is anti-West. This axis of evil is represented by Iran and North Korea. Xi, however, is not part of this axis, although he maintains his so-called neutrality and works for this axis. The challenges associated with neutralizing such threats have a response in the form of the West, these 5 eyes. As the surveillance system of the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Japan is being created, we see actions that indicate the spread of influence not only of Xi Jinping to the Indo-Pacific region, but also about expanding the influence of the United States and the West. We are witnessing a war in quotation marks for the loyalty and favor of those governments that are in the region we are talking about. During the Pacific Security Summit, we noted that Zelensky visited the Philippines, where he met with a leader facing pressure over the Taiwan issue. China asserts its claim over the surrounding seas, leveraging its power. We also observed the situation in Malaysia and the economic and political tensions between China and India, which the West aims to use to influence the region's democratization. The Hamas attack on the Gaza Strip destroyed the route that the United States and India were trying to pave as an alternative to the Chinese one, which would allow the transportation of goods from Asia to Europe and from Europe to Asia. This was a project that was actually approved and supported by investors at the G20 summit. Remember, Ukraine was not invited because Narendra Modi did not want to have any problems, but neither was Biden or Xi Jinping. He and Modi signed an almost ready-made memorandum, and the goods from India were supposed to go through the Arabian Peninsula, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, reaching the Red Sea, then the Mediterranean, and then to Europe and back. However, Hamas effectively destroyed such projects. We also have to look at the situation in Bangladesh, where India and China are competing for leadership. There are also developments in Sri Lanka, where there are similar processes that indicate that the war, although cold, is keeping tensions in the region and creating a real counterweight to potential Chinese aggression. Although it remains cold for now, economic and political confrontation already exists in the Indo-Pacific region, which clearly indicates the problems that exist. Japan began responding 2.5 years ago by agreeing to economically collaborate with Russia on disputed territories, but Putin disrupted this agreement with his aggression. These territories were illegally occupied by Russia after World War II. Similarly, in South Korea, only 13% support helping Ukraine due to fears of harming their economy, which benefits from peace. They hope for lasting peace. While American bases support their economic success, they believe negotiations with Russia and China can mitigate war risks. South Korean President Ryun Suk-yeol wishes to aid Ukraine, but the left-leaning parliament insists that no troops, including instructors, can be sent without its approval. The processes have spun, and the flywheel of the war that Putin was considering against Ukraine is not a world war, but it has a global impact. In the Indo-Pacific region, neutrality is not an option. Countries must choose to support or oppose the security imbalance. Political platforms like the UN are increasingly discredited, as they were established after World War II by the victors to maintain checks and balances. With Russia being part of the problem, the world is uncertain about how to proceed. That is why we see old security systems collapsing and new ones being formed. These new systems will be created as a result of this global war. Countries, whether they want to or not, will take a position. We are witnessing such processes, and China is not in the best situation either. The Western world is turning around very slowly because big ships are hard to maneuver. These problems have not arisen in 2.5 years or even since 2014, but their roots go back decades, starting with the literary spring in Spain, when leading philosophers such as Fukuyama wrote about the end of history, that democracy, liberalism, and the free market had won. Як і до того Радянський Союз є не вирішенням проблеми, самою проблемою, світ не знає, що робити. І тому ми бачимо, яким чином дискредитується старі системи безпеки. But then, Huntington answered him, saying that future conflicts would arise on the basis of civilizational fissures. В ній якусь позицію, хочуть вони цього чи не хочуть. Ну, ми бачимо такого роду процеси, і в ній Китай також знаходиться в не найкращій ситуації. Ну, а Захід, цивілізований світ, вони дуже повільно розвертаються, і великі кораблі довго розвертаються. Зрозуміло, що ці питання, ці проблеми, вони... The issues of identity and national interests are becoming relevant again. Now a mosaic system is being built, but each country has to take its place. Писав про кінець історії, тепер перемогла демократія, лібералізм і вільний ринок. Ні. Потім відповів йому той самий Хантінгтон, який сказав, що майбутні конфлікти будуть по розломам цивілізації, тому що ці питання ідентичності і своїх інтересів вони будуть превалювати. Зрозуміло, що зараз вибудовується такого роду мозаїчна система, але так чи інакше... It is impossible to remain neutral when 5 hoodlums are beating up a conditionally pregnant girl and claim that it is their business. and you are just watching to see who wins. This is blasphemy and cynicism to a certain extent, and neutrals are actually siding with the rapists.
Блюзнірством, цинізмом і так чи інакше ці нейтральники, вони знаходяться на боці гвалтівників. Що і колись, пам'ятаєте, було написано у Данте, що найгірше...
As Dante once wrote, the worst places in hell belong to those who take a position of neutrality. She is in a difficult situation, but we need to think not about she, but about how to try to bring the global south and those who influence it to the side of good. China and India could potentially stop the war, given their competition over meat supplies and the high costs involved. Look at how the Russian economy is bloated with this practically empty money for military orders when Elvira Nabiullina raises the central bank rate to an unprecedented level, 21%. Look at the problems. With such large expenditures, it is easy to collapse the price of oil to $40, and the Putin regime will not last even 3 weeks. Donald Trump said that, assumed such a possibility. Indeed, Day X is approaching. The U.S. elections in the United States are in 2 days. Obviously, their outcome will have an impact not only on the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also on many countries in the world. And China itself is obviously watching the results. So is Russia. And Orban is now saying that if Trump wins the election, Europe will have to rethink its support for Ukraine. The day before, Reuters wrote that if Donald Trump actually wins the election in the United States, Orban could become the closest person to him in Europe, meaning that Orban could actually become Trump's right-hand man in Europe if he wins the election. Orban said the following the day before, "Europe really cannot fight this war alone. And if the United States moves to peace if Trump wins, Europe cannot remain pro-war," Orban says. At the same time, the American edition of CNN writes that Putin is unlikely to hold peace talks with Ukraine, even if Donald Trump wins the election. It cites analysts who say that if Trump fails to quickly force Putin to peace, his advisors will tell him that Russian aggression continues with the help of China, explaining this to him. In fact, Trump may categorically change his position on supporting Ukraine and his attitude toward Russia, and at the same time, China. What do you think about the price of controversial publications on the one hand, and on the other hand, what should we expect from Donald Trump if he wins the election? Let's start with this. Ukrainian proverb, "A lousy sheep spoils the whole flock," which refers to Orban and the European Union, Fico and various pro-Russian forces from Austria and Germany to Bulgaria and Montenegro. Look now at Dodik, for example, which is Republika Srpska in Bosnia. Well, the precedent is contagious. But on the other hand, what should Orban do? He has practically blackmailed Europe, and Hungarian citizens like it so far, but Mr. Magyar is catching up with him, and I think he will overtake him. But the question now is not who would be talking about Orban if Orban, was not bullheaded. Why are we apologizing to him? He has no choice. Trump doesn't care about Orban. He probably confused him with Erdogan. He only learned of Orban recently. While Orban claims Trump is his friend, it doesn't mean he has any real influence. Regarding Trump, it was challenging to hear predictions that events would unfold in just a few weeks, with Fukuyama claiming Russia had only 10 days left. I feel relieved now, as I no longer feel the need to despair. Regardless of who wins in the U.S., objective processes indicate that Russia will ultimately lose under various circumstances. We no longer need the format we discussed.
що ми з вами про це говорили.
We must understand that the world is not linear. As we discussed regarding China and Russia, processes are interdependent. The Soviet Union collapsed partly due to Ukrainians, which I remember from my involvement in those events. Ultimately, it couldn't endure the war's costs and the resulting economic issues, similar to the current system in Russia. There is stratification and so on. Injustice. First of all, oil prices. Détente destroyed the Soviet Union. The expenditures are large oil dollars, which in the 70s went away due to what was happening, among other things, with the support of the Soviet Union in the Middle East when there was the Yom Kippur War in 73, when practically Russian officers were in every company, in every platoon of the army of Egypt and at that time Syria. So thanks to this, there was an embargo, high oil prices, the Soviet Union was swimming in petrodollars. And then all of these things came to light when the economy did not develop, and almost all of it collapsed. Putin himself is the second derivative of the oil price. He came to power in 99 in December, when the price of oil was 9.8 per barrel. And 8 years later, it was already $148. So the question is that Russia, the Russian economy, Putin, is practically, remember Margaret Thatcher's words, upper volta with missiles. It's not the upper volta anymore. It's a completely different name, but the same situation is developing. The late Republican Senator John McCain said that this is the world's gas station. That's why the détente, including Israel's attack on Iran, has caused the price of oil to drop by 4 times. I'm referring to the metaphor of sprinkling ashes on your head. Democrats, including Biden and Kamala Harris, initially called for peace and urged Israel not to respond. However, when Israel did respond, they, like the Republicans, had to support Israel. Notably, the so-called progressive Democrats opposed aid to Israel in the same package as Ukraine and did not support Mike Johnson's proposal at the time because they were reluctant to help Israel. Now, all of them support Israel. Because it does not care about the opinions in the UN. As Golda Meir said, if you want to survive, there is no room for compromise. Trying to persuade Israel or Ukraine to make concessions through aggression only motivates further attacks and escalates existing tensions, including potential issues on the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan. They will emerge from Venezuela as a statement to the world. A redistribution of power may occur if security fails. If Russia continues to support aggressors, the world will face chaos. Trump's promise to quickly end the war offers simplistic alternatives to the current administration's approach, similar to what any opposition leader would propose. Trump, being a colorful figure, exemplifies this with his Twitter diplomacy. If the government is doing this, then I will say that it is doing it wrong. Trump, to a certain extent on the one hand, is somewhat perceived to be Putin's friend. But I emphasize once again, will Xi Jinping like it? For example, Israel, roughly speaking, wants Trump to win, but Iran really wants Kamala Harris to win. The world is far more complex, and the idea that Putin will reach an agreement with Trump is both childish and irresponsible. In 2016, many believed a great deal was possible, yet I questioned this while commenting on pro-Russian programs in the Baltics. I asked why the situation would change, as groups like the Alawites in Assad's army wouldn't simply agree to be sacrificed due to sanctions. It doesn't work that way. Now we have seen that all the players have also gained some muscle, and it is not easy to reach an agreement. I don't think that Trump will want his expectations of pro-Russianism to be fulfilled, because they will say, we said that in 2016 he illegitimately gained power. Russia interfered, even though it did. Trump disagreed with this because it turns out that he got the presidency in 2016 through limited sovereignty. For the first time in American history, it is the sovereign right of American citizens to elect their president, meaning that he cannot accept anything that delegitimizes his power. Now, he will not agree with the fact that it is allegedly confirmed that he was actually pro-Russian. They wanted to impeach him because he interfered in the situation with Ukraine, putting his interests above the interests of the United States. This was true. We have to understand that these historic statements by Medvedev, that Trump will suffer the fate of JFK if he makes a deal, they will not make a deal. The interests of Putin and Xi Jinping do not coincide, and Trump cannot consolidate the expected interests of all global players. It is not in his interest to give up Ukraine. The other issue is that we have to understand that the situation in America itself is not only split, but it also splits attitudes toward Americans. Attitudes of Europeans, attitudes in Ukraine towards certain leaders in the United States, and the election. Many people have created a kind of voodooism for themselves, made a doll of Trump, and are poking him with needles, thinking that their verbal spears will make him feel worse. This was the case in 2016. Do you remember the Ukrainian oligarch who backed Hillary Clinton? After the election, despite her receiving more votes than Trump, discussions arose about leasing Crimea through various experts. We even found a member of the Verkhovna Rada from the Lyashko faction who claimed to have such a plan. Trump saw this oligarch and the connections he had with deputies, leading him to wonder why he shouldn't meet with them if this was the situation in Ukraine. These were either Trump's plans or those of Ukrainians hoping to align with him. We shouldn't fuel these divisions. Bipartisan support is essential in the U.S. Just as Israel acts proactively, those candidates divided on aiding Ukraine, like Kamala Harris and Trump, oddly unite when it comes to supporting Israel.
Щодо допомоги Україні, я кажу про Камалу Харріс і Трампа, вони чомусь, я беру слово в лапки, об'єднані навколо допомоги Ізраїлю.
And today they are warning Iran that they will not deter Israel if Iran suddenly begins to respond to what happened to Iran when its entire air defense system was virtually destroyed. He is practically defenseless, but can blackmail through the Houthis and attack Saudi Aramco plants, leveraging remnants of terrorist groups and states backed by Russia in the UN Security Council. In this context, U.S. interests clearly align with Ukraine, as it's the Putinites in Russia who create leaders like Putin, not the other way around. Putin does not create Russia. Rather, Russia creates leaders like him. They believe they are at war with the West, particularly the United States, using this conflict to gain support from regimes like Maduro's and others, including Kim Jong-un. Populists like Orban and Fico first blackmail for aid and then claim they had warned about potential consequences. I mean, in my lifetime, they have beaten me up. They are blackmailing Europe. And Europe, instead of kicking them out of the European Union, believe me, then Orban would have much more problems. He would be thinking about how to preserve at least his economic wealth, because his companies mostly have economic contracts. He would have been burning these forints. They would have been burning like our coupon mints in the 90s every day. But if the world allows itself to be blackmailed, and I'm talking about Euro-Atlantic civilization here, it gets the problems that Churchill once said: between the choice of shame and war, Shame, you choose war. I don't think Trump will want to choose disgrace if he wins. We need bipartisan support, and we are closely watching the results of the American elections. Only 2 days left. Thank you, friends. Valery Dymov, political analyst, has been in touch with us. We're going to take a short break and come back.